These days, so many people surrender themselves to the authority of abstract symbols without submitting to the proper authority of their own conscience. And the phenomenon of modern day Caesar worship, especially amongst the younger generation, unfortunately epitomizes this phenomenon. The West, my friends, and the United States most importantly, which is where I live, are facing quite a few problems, from the problems of mass migration eroding a sense of cultural cohesion amongst members of numerous Western nations, to a sort of digital economy that seems to be eroding our focus and eroding our sense of connection with each other, to other issues like the cost of living and sort of like faraway political authority not being representative to the people. So many problems. And some people are convinced that the solution to various problems, whether they be economic, social, cultural, whatever, must be found within a Caesarian figure. Some will explicitly actually say that Caesar, a Caesar, the rise of a new Caesar for the modern world, would actually fix all of the issues that we have. But I'm here to tell you that not only is the idea of a Caesar quite dangerous to our moral understanding and also dangerous to our formation as responsible people, but it is a sort of rehash of several errors that it would encourage all of us to understand as we continue to grapple with the various issues the West face. So in this video, my friends, I will make the case that Caesarism, rather than actually saving the West or fixing any problems, will actually doom the West to an end that no civilization that wishes to grow and prosper should ever face. But before we get into that, my friends, I hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Pensive Politics. If you are a fan of political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our channel and our project here is successful. This is a civic conservative project built upon philosophy, built upon the truths of natural law, built upon a robust understanding of first principles, and this is an attempt to push that back into the public square and to make that the guiding North Star of our conversations, rather than superficiality and shallow reactiveness, which unfortunately has come to define much of our public discourse today. So if this vision resonates with you, then I encourage you, like, share, comment, subscribe. If you wish, you'll be doing it as well. Thank you so much for being here. Now, please enjoy the video. So, as I mentioned, there is an emphasis and a push amongst people, especially the younger crowd, in having a sort of Caesarian figure come and supposedly save the West. And this push manifests in different ways. Before I critique it, it's good to understand the nature of something before you critique it, because that way you can perhaps offer some charitability towards it, and then after that you can begin to unpack its problems. Some of it comes from a sort of mystic, prophetic understanding of history. There is a contingent of people that believe in the works of philosophers like Oswald Spengler, who prophesied a kind of coming of a Caesarian figure and prophesied that civilization evolves in a certain way, where a single autocratic figure will rise up and will have the power as a strong man and will be able to fix things, or rather be able to govern with an iron fist. So some people are saying that we are overdue for a kind of Spenglerian prophecy here, and they will say that a Caesar is inevitable. Others have given up on the governing principles of republicanism, which has come to define the unique character and DNA of the American political system, because republicanism emphasizes the virtues of a free citizenry, and they believe the free citizenry is actually the problem. They actually believe the free citizenry, freedom being the antecedent of the free citizenry, is actually the problem, because the kind of freedom that is known to sort of Enlightenment type Western thinking is the kind of freedom for vice, in their opinion. So regardless of where this idea comes from, it almost always channels this sort of frustration and this critique into the figure of the Caesar. Now, I must say, before I explore this further, that whenever someone is facing a problem, or whenever someone sees a problem in their world, it is more often than not a tactic to escape that problem by romanticizing a particular idea and then attempting to apply the implications of that idea towards the society they are in. This is what I believe many people who have engaged in Caesar worship are actually doing. They have romanticized a single a category of historical figure from a long time ago, and they believe that category of historical figure, since it may have been effective at a particular moment in time, which, by the way, it would behoove all of us to actually examine the effectiveness of the Caesar. And I think if you look at the historical record, as we're going to do in a second, you're actually going to see that the effectiveness is much more of an illusion than it is an actual reality. But I digress. They will then look at the effectiveness and say, you know what, this thing here can be our panacea. But the danger of romanticizing an idea, rather than treating the idea as it actually plays out in practical reality, is that we get both a limited understanding of that idea, number one, and number two, we don't actually accurately assess what might happen if that idea is to be applied in a particular area. So it's very important for us to avoid the pitfall of romanticization, whether it be with Caesar or anyone else, when it comes to dealing with the issues of our society. But also, speaking of romanticization, I've noticed a trend amongst people, which is especially prevalent in this phenomenon, where they aestheticize authority, or they aestheticize despair, or they aestheticize something that they think ought to be the standard. And that is precisely what is happening here. I think that the way a lot of people are thinking about Caesar as a savior is a result of disordered aesthetics. They will look at, for example, a picture of the Caesar. They will look at a picture and they will see various things upon that picture or upon that statue that symbolize authority, that symbolize power, and they will then have an emotional reaction to those things, and that emotional reaction will guide them towards their support for that particular figure. And this is actually quite an interesting thing. So let's actually look at a picture of a Caesar to kind of get into this idea. So Augustus, the first Roman Caesar. Here's a picture of him on your screen, and what's happening here is actually rather interesting. So what you see, I won't belabor this too much, but it's actually very interesting. What you see here is you see a man standing upright. Him standing upright conveys a kind of confidence and a kind of authority that sort of emanates off of him, and he's pointing towards a certain direction. Well, him pointing towards a certain direction is almost as if he is a guide, sort of explorer, giving the people behind him, or in this case below him, direction. And explicitly, there is a young baby-like figure clinging towards his vestments here, and that baby-like figure is obviously going to go wherever he goes. And of course, he is dressed in his sort of upper body is dressed in a kind of armor, and he is carrying a kind of also regal vestment here. So this very picture alone conveys this aesthetic of power and authority as a guide, as a director, as a sort of former of civilizations, a sort of former of futures. And this kind of disordered aesthetics, my friends, can precisely get people into the trap of believing that the Caesar is the answer here. But the problem is, aesthetics is actually a tool we can all use to form our moral understanding. In fact, aesthetics, when it is properly understood, reflects the proportional order of the world. Beauty is simply nothing more, as the great philosopher Lord Keynes argued in his Essays on the Principles of Morality and Natural Religion. Beauty is nothing more than the order of certain things that get us close towards the sublime, and that also help us understand how things are and when they are in their proper way, when they are in their proper dimensions. And the reason that gets us closer to the sublime is because beauty, being measurable, being understandable, can evoke this sense into us about the a well-designed proportioned nature of things, which then gets us closer to this sort of awe-inspiring moment, which is the sublime. So aesthetics can actually lead us towards moral decisions by evoking within us an understanding of order, which is important for understanding of morality, and then leading us towards a pathway of rationally applying our minds to the world in a way that respects this proportion. But when aesthetics is solely a vehicle for emotional sensibility, for romanticization, for this awe-inspiring fiction that many of us create when we see things like that statue of Augustus, it no longer becomes a moral tool. It becomes a disordered tool that ruins our inner lives, ruins our abilities to objectively consider concepts, and puts us in a posture where we are thinking with our passions and ignoring our minds and also ignoring our conscience. This is why the Caesarian mentality is an enemy to conscience because it sacralizes power. It sacralizes authority. It treats authority and power as the movers of our civilizations rather than actually treating a conscious-driven, duty-bound people who also bear rights as the proper agents that move civilization. You will notice, if you look at history, power alone never moves anything. Power is always contained within a dimension of those who are willing to honor it. And so long as there are people that are willing to honor power, it can move mountains. But it's not the power moving anything. It is the people that legitimize it. And this insight was this insight was practiced for thousands of years, but it was only admitted in the past 300, 400 plus years since the dawn of the Enlightenment towards our modern age. And the Caesar was no different in how this formation of power played out. But an objective understanding of power is never admitted when we are in our romantic state where we obsess over appearances and our conscience suffers from it. The reason our conscience suffers from it, my friends, and this actually goes to why Caesarism, I would call it, is a direct threat to our conscience, is because it removes the emphasis from us as people and the problems that happen in our world. And it also removes the emphasis for us to engage with them. So no person can solve everything, obviously, whether that be a leader in government, whether that be a king, whether that be an actual citizen. But we can most certainly begin to focus on solving problems by interacting with them with our insight. And our insight must be influenced by something higher, or else we'll simply be people that have knowledge without actually having the wisdom to apply it. Someone who has knowledge that has no wisdom to apply it is simply a knowledgeable fool. But the person that has knowledge and the wisdom to apply it immediately becomes a person ripe for virtue. And your conscience is the faculty that keeps all of that intact. But Caesarism, by displacing focus from the conscience of the person and putting it in this far-flung area, not only removes our ability to actually understand these issues, it removes our ability to impact our own world positively, because the Caesar becomes the focal point of all change, rather than the people properly being the focal point of all change. And this obviously carries with it a coercive element. When you understand the nature of society, my friends, the Caesar worship becomes even more dangerous and becomes even more concerning, especially to one who understands the principles of conservatism. Caesarism opposes sociability. Sociability is the inherent sense that every single one of us as human beings have within our very nature that moves us into society and that provides a foundation upon which our ethics and our moral principles flow. Sociability is that sense that gives us a social appetite, that wishes us to come and form groups and covenants that eventually end up being a broader society and also end up being a civilization. But the idea of a Caesar treats society as a top-down entity to be managed by one with power, rather than a entity that emerges from the moral formation of a people that understand the responsibilities they have towards each other, and by translating that, the responsibilities power has towards them. Society and political order, social and political order, actually run parallel. It's a mistake to think they are completely separate. They're not separate. They run parallel. They're not downstream, they're parallel. People say, well, politics is downstream of culture. I wish that were true, because if that were true, I think that the political order in America would be much healthier, because there are wide swaths of our country that are independent, that are rustic, that are assertive in their understanding of things, in their rights. And politics does not at all even come close to reflecting that. But I digress. So they run parallel. If you have a healthy social order, it's going to have a certain reflection upon your political order, because that social order is not just going to keep the political order in check. It's going to provide a foundation for that political order to rise and to be legitimized. But not only that, it's going to provide a foundation for people to understand the responsibilities they have towards others, independent of politics, and the responsibilities the statesman, the politician, has towards them, independent of anything else as well. This is why the American founders framed this as a experiment of first principles, so to speak. Caesarism says no. It does not run parallel. It doesn't even run downstream. That the society is literally a construct to be ordered at the pleasure of the Caesar in his own infinite wisdom. Well, you can't really admit of this, because not only does it violate sociability, not only does it impede moral responsibility, but it violates one of the most supreme and I think one of the most definitive laws in the world, in the natural law, in the nature of things, and that is salus populi suprema lex. The welfare of the people is the big consideration. That is a Latin phrase that translates to the welfare of the people is the big consideration. There's many different ways that this is kind of translated, but what I just said is the general understanding of it. Salus populi suprema lex is very important because it actually forms the foundation of good governance. And good governance is the difference between power being a tool of destruction and power being a force of protection and a force bound by moral duty, which then collapses the ability of tyranny to actually be a dangerous thing and also produces a moral form of order. See, Caesarism assumes that it will fix the problems of our society because it brings forth order. And order, my friends, is most certainly important. Order actually, whether it be conceptually in how we understand ideas, whether it be morally in how we direct our actions towards particular ends, that's a very ordered formation, or whether it be socially in which we have certain laws which protect people from certain things, and we have contracts which assure certain things, we have promises, we have fidelity. These all induce forms of order. Order is very important, but order cannot be sustained solely by power. Order cannot be sustained solely by fear, and order cannot be sustained solely by tradition. Because where tradition is questioned and it is insufficient for the modern world, it must either be updated or its better parts, which are sufficient, must be taken, and everything else must be left behind. Not questioning tradition while attempting to be a traditional soul is going to keep you in a pattern of stasis where you are stuck, and your society is stuck, and your civilization is stuck, and your inner life is stuck. But taking the good parts of tradition and applying them fruitfully actually is going to lead to a point where those old truths are respected in their signification and the old flaws are left behind. But a power that says we derive it solely from tradition, we derive order solely from tradition, is an order that cannot actually live for the demands of first principles in our modern society. It cannot live for the demands of morality in our modern society. But Caesarism assumes this to be the case. Order, real order, is sustained by an understanding of conscience. I mentioned that earlier in our video. An understanding of rightful conduct. It's sustained, most importantly, by an active participation in our society and a mutual intercourse of sympathy and benevolence amongst the people. And most importantly, it is cemented by reflection, by which man understands why he does what he does. He understands his world. He meditates on it. And moral education, where that reflection goes from simply understanding to being able to apply what you understand to the world. That is what a good form of order is. But the Caesarian model, where order is imposed and not birthed, imposed from above and not birthed from below, is a model where order is only as good as those who can maintain a sense of fear and domination, and it is never sustainable, and it is never as good as a society that can maintain and generate it from below, which simply requires, rather than fear, simply requires active conscience and loyalty to higher ideas. That is the notion that America was founded upon. And that is why the Caesarian dream, as I call it, is so dangerous. It's not simply authoritarian, but it's also a sort of artificial imitation of the things that a moral society and a people of conscience actually require. It's not just detached from reality by birth of romanticization. It's detached from reality also by its unwillingness to understand the context in which our behavior happens. If you're concerned about degeneracy, you ought to understand how degeneracy arises and how it can be corrected. You will never understand that if power is your first and only answer to everything. Before I close, my friends, I want to actually address a few things as well. I do believe there is a younger generation in this country and in the West that is fundamentally lost, who do not who, by the way, quite justifiably in some cases, see a world not working for them, and they believe that the only way to get out of that world that's not working for them is to embrace a kind of old style sort of authoritarianism that can order the world in a much better way. I would actually like us to look at the historical record and see from the very civilization that Caesar comes from, Rome, how this approach has actually been so negative. When the question about Caesar arises, we have to, about Caesar supposedly saving the West, we have to ask ourselves the question, who's going to save Caesar? This is actually a rather important question, because as the rather wise Xenophon, the philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher, mentioned in his discourse on the Hieron, Tyrannicus, is that when a ruler is in power, he suffers more pains than he does when he is not, when he is rather a peasant, when he's not in power. And those pains can cause a kind of tyranny of the self, where the passions of the ruler, the fears of the ruler, the wants of the ruler, paired with his sort of unlimited power, can overtake them and sink them before anyone else does. This is why historically a lot of kings and rulers fall to decadence. They get involved in infidelity. They get involved in overindulging in substances. They get involved in constant paranoia. They execute people in their inner circle, because the nature of authority itself produces a tyranny of the self that in all reality leads nothing more than a sinking ship of a person. So who's going to save Caesar from himself? If Caesar's going to save all of us, we have to ask ourselves the question, given what we understand from the empirical record, who will save Caesar himself? But there's another question I think we should also consider. Many Roman emperors themselves, stretching from Tiberius, who was a second Roman emperor, towards Domitian, who was an emperor that was authoritarian but is considered to be good somehow because he built things, right? If you have like a utilitarian calculus, he may be considered good, although I think he was still ruthless and he was still much of a tyrant. From that period of history, if you look at all the Roman emperors from that period of history, they either had very short reigns that only lasted a few years. They were either executed or betrayed by those who were closest to them. They were either suffered from coups. They were not even in power enough to have any effect because of the politics happening around them. So from Tiberius to Domitian, we see this sort of grisly and bloody record where the Caesars themselves die, those around them die, where impulse overtakes justice, which led to short reigns, where citizens are constantly under the threat of dying themselves, and there's social collapse, and there's other unjust uses of political authority. There is no duty to be found in this formulation. There's only viciousness, my friends. There's only passion. There's two categories. There's the social principles and there's the vicious principles. The vicious principles is our anger, our tendency to violence as a human being, our sense of jealousy, vengeance. These are the vicious things that atrophy the society. And the social principles are our sense of justice, of fidelity, of conscience, of veracity, our allegiance to truth. In Rome's history, in the Roman Empire's history, you see all those social principles get put to the wayside for pragmatic, practical, in their words, authoritarian posturing. And of course, Rome still suffered from decadence. Rome still suffered from social squalor, despite the fact of having these strong Caesars. In fact, the Caesars themselves were some of the most decadent people ever. Look at Nero's life, for example. So we have to ask ourselves, who is going to save Caesar? No one. Because if Caesar couldn't save himself at the height of his power, in a civilization that was rather distinct from our current world, how in the world will Caesar save himself in the current world, where he has far more threats than just jealous people or even his own mind? How will he contend? He won't, because he can't, because he couldn't before. And wisdom does not suggest that he can right now. We must stop relying on symbols, over-relying on symbols in a concrete world. The authoritarian impulse, my friends, is a dead end. It does not produce anything more than suffering, than limitations, and most importantly, a destruction of moral duty. The way to fight decadence, the way to fight squalor, the way to fight vice is not by attempting to control people through power. It's by attempting to induce people a sense of moral responsibility and, most importantly, a sense of moral duty, rooted in the natural law, rooted in first principles that appeals to their conscience, by attempting to construct a good inner life within them, which will then necessarily produce a sound and well-ordered outer life. Moral order, not political order, is going to correct the problems the West faces right now. But if we submit to political order in hopes that it will instill moral order, you will get a counterfeit of the latter and you will get the worst form of the former. Nothing good can come from blending two incompatible modes of action together in an attempt to produce a sound result. Because we understand those things generally do not work out very well at all. My friends, Caesarism is a dead end. It's a dead end that will do nothing more than not only set us back in our understanding, but it will ruin the moral formations of all of us if we let it. Let's reject Caesarism. Let's reject romanticization of power and of authority. And let us look inwards towards the authority of our hearts. Let's build a culture of the heart where we can correct the bad things going on by appealing to our own good qualities and allowing those to become the standard for others through action, through submission to justice, through submission to our moral duties as people, and most importantly, through setting an example for the world to follow. As Americans, we have a moral intellectual heritage that we ought to follow, that our founders bequeathed upon us. And I think now the solution is to turn towards 1776 rather than turning towards Rome. Because I think in 1776, even though they got some things wrong, they had some crazy tendencies, there's a lot of wisdom in that approach that is eternal and goes beyond that moment. So my friends, join me in turning towards that moment. Join me, of course, in the Pensive cohort, which I launched a while ago, which is an attempt for me to recruit an army of thinkers who will advocate these principles and much more into our current discourse. Like, share, comment, subscribe, my friends. Donate to me if you are so well inclined. Thank you guys so much for being here. My friends, study history, study philosophy, resist the allure of abstract symbols, reject Caesar, embrace your reason, embrace your conscience, embrace justice, embrace the natural law, and most importantly, my friends, stay pensive. Bye-bye, everyone.